Welcome everyone to the Black Friday episode of The Damage Report. This is an important episode because Black Friday is honestly more of an American tradition than Thanksgiving at this point. I'm joking, but only partially. But anyway, hopefully you're well fed, hopefully not too sore from the food that you ate yesterday. But we wanted to give you something special today as we're off, both myself and all of the crew for the holidays. We're gonna be taking a look back at the year so far on the Damage Report and some of the segments that we've had. And I really wanted to go wide with the topics here. So with hundreds of clips to choose from, we've got some politics, obviously, some science, some environment, but we're gonna be starting off with something very different. Earlier this year, in anticipation of the last season of Game of Thrones, Brett Erlich joined me in doing something we don't often do on the show, which is just talking about our interests. And we decided to get in it on the worst decisions that Game of Thrones characters had made. It was a lot of fun. Hopefully you'll enjoy it. In a lot of ways, Game of Thrones is a story of people making hard decisions and often decisions that they immediately regret. And so in this video, we're gonna break down the 10 worst decisions in Game of Thrones history. Brett, you've been going through your list. What is your number 5?
Number 5 is Daenerys not listening to Lady Olenna. There is a time when Lady Olenna takes, first of all, spoiler alert, blah, blah, blah.
Oh yeah, no, this is obviously all spoilers. So if you haven't watched all of season 7, don't watch this.
No, go watch season 7 now. We'll wait, come back, yes. Watch all the show. Okay, so Lady Olenna, the Queen of Thorns, the, prickly, funny,
the sassy, witty older woman. Yes,
she goes.
Awesome.
So at a time when Daenerys is taking too much advice from her, from Tyrion and everyone on trying to play the politics of Westeros, Lady Olenna says the lords are sheep. Just if you're a dragon, be a dragon. She does not act like a dragon. She does not just immediately storm King's Landing, and she loses most of her allies in this weird and attempt at being the diplomatic conqueror.
Yeah.
That doesn't need to happen. She should have listened to Lady Olenna, who knew that for so long. It ends up actually costing Lady Olenna the ultimate price.
Yeah, and when she does finally be a dragon, it starts to work for her.
It works.
Yeah.
But we've lost time and we've opened ourselves up to an ongoing war with Cersei and company as you try to tackle the true menace in the north when you could have gotten rid of that just by listening to Lady Olenna.
This is one of, so I was saying in the break that this series generally doesn't do the thing where people make bad decisions to benefit the plot. This is one of those. She comes, she's too strong, they can't have her just win, so they come up with excuses for her to not just attack King's Landing, but it doesn't really read.
Yeah.
Okay, my number 5 is, this is the most reasonable wrong decision, but he does regret it. It's the Viper taunting the Mountain when he's got the Mountain on his back. Like, dude, you won. Nobody thought you were going to win, but you won, somehow you won. You got what you wanted, but it wasn't enough. And so you start taunting him and your brains end up scattered all over the cobblestones. And it was devastating. Awesome scene, good job there. But Pedro Pascal was such a good actor, I would have loved to have gotten another season or 2 out of him.
Yeah, that is a great answer. It is a frustrating thing. And that one's the kind that gets more frustrating when you watch it again.
Yeah.
Watching it again, I'm like, oh my God. That scene plays out so magnificently. The first time you watch it, they build the tension that you don't know what's happening. It is an onslaught from the get-go of the Viper taking down the Mountain. And you're like, this isn't gonna work. Oh my God, it's great.
Yeah, he's doing it.
And it also benefits.
You're doing it, Peter, you're doing it.
But it also benefits from this weird thing where you're watching and be like, this is like the 3rd trial by combat. It's gonna work for him again? How are they gonna get away with the champion defeating the one who represented law to begin with? But it just is so devastating. And not to mention physically wrecking you to watch.
It's just disgusting. Yeah.
Okay. For me, number 4 is Renly not siding with Stannis.
Yeah.
It is very frustrating because if you're Renly and Stannis is your bro, literally, and he's older than you, and you're claiming some kind of natural line of succession. Of course, Renly does realize that politics are at play here, but he has no claim to that throne.
Yeah.
None.
Well, and the thing is too, I don't really remember in the books exactly how it plays out, but we don't know enough about Renly to set up that he would spurn his brother and try to take it for himself.
Well, he does have a moment with Ned Stark in the Capitol where he's like, listen, no one would follow Stannis. He's not good. We hate him. So I'm going to cut some corners and I have more people.
That's all true, but to turn against your family is one of the biggest things a character can do in Game of Thrones, and that one really isn't set up. Yeah. And it doesn't work out for him.
Yeah, so you've pointed out to me that mine two are weighted down in horribility of decision, essentially because they don't necessarily feel motivated by the thing that makes Game of Thrones great, which is characters who make decisions based on what they value.
This one I might just not be remembering.
These are plotty, and I get it, but just so you know, that is why they're at the bottom of my top 5 list.
Well, my number 4 is a weird one, but it's kind of a pair. The way that the slavers act doesn't make any sense. So they sell 8,000 Unsullied to Daenerys Targaryen, and shockingly, she turns against them, which nobody was expecting. But like anybody could have done that, with or without dragons. You've got an army standing in the middle of your city. You hand over ultimate control with no controls of your own on that. Why wouldn't anyone sack your city?
Say that? Wait, what?
He hands over the whip, he gets his dragon.
Oh, yeah.
She's got 8,000 soldiers. That's 99% of the soldiers in the city. Why wouldn't they take over?
Yeah, he was blinded by his dragon wanting.
I guess he did want the dragon.
This all happened so fast to him.
It did.
Because he was like, listen, you're gonna get 20 of those dudes probably, because you look pretty poor. Yeah. Then it's, hey, dragon. And he's like, yes, I want that. Didn't really think it through. He has a dragon.
Yeah. They probably don't sell thousands at a time normally.
Right.
And then they sail to Marine knowing that she has dragons, you fools.
Yeah.
Anyway, they made some bad business decisions.
Yeah, but they are pretty effective when they bind together by the order of the Harpy or whatever it is.
That's true. They got some gains there. Okay, what's your number 3?
My number 3 is not marrying the Frey girl.
Oh, yeah.
Dude. You can, but listen, Talisa. I understand that Una Chaplin's one fine human being.
She's great.
She is not only a great doctor, but doctor.
No, but they really bond, and
that's true love I saw.
It is true love.
And who would blame them?
Yeah.
Because I was in love with her and I never met her. Jesus. But you made a promise to the Freys, you didn't marry the Frey girl, and as a result, you lost everything for your family. So that was real stupid.
Yeah, a lot of people died because he happened across this nurse woman. Yeah, that was a bad call. My number 3 has to do with Littlefinger. Littlefinger's thing is that he is the manipulator. He thinks about more options. He is playing 10-dimensional chess. All of that, and all of it's basically true. He is what drives the plot initially of the whole series. Super smart and clever. But his ultimate flaw is that he can't stop telling people how manipulative and clever he is. That undercuts your ability to deceive people if you keep telling them like, I'm working behind the scenes. And that trains Sansa to not trust him. It trains her to be able to tell when he's manipulating her. And that ultimately gets his throat slit because he couldn't stop bragging about how much smarter and more deceptive he was than everyone else.
Do you think he actually loved Sansa?
On some level, I don't think he had the ability that everyone else does necessarily to feel true emotions, but I think he was attracted to her. I think he did protect her more than he needed to, maybe.
Even on the rewatch, it wasn't very clear to me whether he was using that, because he does give her over to
that's true.
The Boltons. Because the one central theme is like, don't love anyone. One of the central themes is don't love anyone because you're gonna be blinded by that and you're gonna lose everything.
He does. Yeah.
And it's, his thing was one of hubris, I think, more than it was like the overshare was based on hubris more than it was like.
Maybe he thought, I've got the veil now, it's all coming together, but he hadn't won yet.
Yep. Number 2 for me, Cersei using the faith militant.
Well, that was a bad call. You're right.
It was just so stupid. And rewatching it, you're like, ugh, this arc. Because you're so stupid.
Mm-hmm. It's a little bit more complex in the books, but in both cases, you're right. You really thought that, you know what's controllable? Religious extremism.
Yeah.
No, that's a bad call.
She thought it would be great. She did it very short-sighted because she's getting so protective of her son and she doesn't want to give him away. Mm-hmm. Fine, buy him action figure or something.
Yeah,
Try
buy him
to
another cat.
Buy his affection. Don't go through the faith militant to get his wife locked up.
Yeah, and if you are gonna blow up everyone that this kid loves and trusts now, like be in the room with him when you do that.
Yeah.
That'd be a good call. My number 2 was Theon deciding to turn on Robb Stark.
That's a great one.
To rekindle his relationship with his family that he doesn't know, that he hasn't known since he was a little boy. Like Theon was living his best life. He was riding at the side of the young wolf. He was winning in battles. Like he had it all. He would have ended up getting a holdfast or something like that in the north. Instead, he ends up with the sausage situation and all the other bad stuff that's happened to him. And it all comes back to him turning on Robb.
What an amazing actor.
He's a very good actor.
And that is
underrated, I think.
And that is one where it's motivated by the character. I see that internal struggle happening. And playing out. Okay.
But you fool. And he knows it. And when Ramsay makes him think that he's escaping and is leading him away, and Theon admits that he was wrong, he chose wrong, he should have chosen the Starks. I love that scene more than almost any other scene in the series because he's admitting that, not under torture. He's admitting that when he thinks he's already escaped. And he still knows what he did wrong, and I love it.
Yeah.
What's your number 1?
Number 1 is Ned Stark not going with Renly.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
Spoiler alert, that's my number 1 too.
Yeah, okay, so we can agree on that. And it really is so amazing. Why do you think it's your number
1? Well, my number 1 is specifically warning Cersei.
Yeah.
Like you're gonna have to do something difficult. He's even willing to compromise his ethics a little bit working with Littlefinger, but he still feels like he has to warn Cersei. He has to protect the kids and all that. He tells her she can flee. He doesn't know her at all. He doesn't know how this game is played at all.
But that is the most Game of Thrones thing. And it's the most significant decision for redefining how television works in America. Because before that, there was hero armor. Before that, there was, I know him. He's the leading actor who I recognize in the series. He'll be around forever. And watching it back is utterly different than watching it the first time through. Watching it the first time through, I did not see it coming whatsoever. Rewatching it, I see it coming
a mile away
from the first scene, essentially, of the movie. Because now I look at Game of Thrones, I look at all television the way I look at Game of Thrones, which is not the good guy wins because he's good and the bad guy loses and acts every way because he's bad. Game of Thrones is about they have words, they have a philosophy that governs all of their actions, and they live by that and die by that. And he did it, and there is virtue and value to all those things, but at the end of the day, it was his undoing because he had honor but no strategy. And you see everybody that is still alive for the most part say, that's a dumb strategy, bud. And say, come with me, this is about practical survival more than it is pledging yourself to some weird honor that is thousands of years old.
Yeah, he was ill-equipped for that situation. He was a battle commander. That's what he was. He wasn't even really a fighter. He was a soldier, and now he has to be involved in all this politics and everything. And he didn't want to be there in the first place. He's one of the only people who didn't want any of the power that was given to him. And I love how the same process he went through is visited on Robb. Robb makes some of the same mistakes, and then to Jon, they talk about how he's doing the same thing, and we'll see if it happens the third, if the third time is the charm in this case. But yeah, it just such bad decisions on his part. And it was so long ago I read it initially. I don't even remember, but I was shocked. I know I was shocked, but I can't even remember how shocked I was. Terrible decision, Ned Stark.
We need to talk about a relatively new show called the Republic, or UNFTR. As a Young Turks fan, you already know that the government, the media, and corporations are constantly peddling lies that serve the interests of the rich and powerful. But now there's a podcast dedicated to unraveling those lies, debunking the conventional wisdom. In each episode of the Republic, or UNFTR, the host delves into a different historical episode or topic that's generally misunderstood or purposely obfuscated by the so-called powers that be, featuring in-depth research, razor-sharp commentary, and just the right amount of vulgarity. The UNFTR podcast takes a sledgehammer to what you thought you knew about some of the nation's most sacred historical cows. But don't just take my word for it. The New York Times described UNFTR as consistently compelling and educational, aiming to challenge conventional wisdom and upend the historical narratives that were taught in school. For as the great philosopher Yoda once put it, "You must unlearn what you have learned." And that's true whether you're in Jedi training or you're uprooting and exposing all the propaganda and disinformation you've been fed over the course of your lifetime. So search for UNFDR in your podcast app today and get ready to get informed, angered, and entertained all at the same time.
We are quite a way into this Democratic primary. The first caucuses and primaries are like a month or two away at this point. And throughout all of it, the front runner, Joe Biden, who's been leading for a very long time, one of what we would have predicted as his biggest weaknesses hasn't really come up at all. And that is his enthusiastic support for the war in Iraq. Now, I can't guarantee that it will become a bigger part of this contest, but if it does, it will serve to potentially be the biggest differentiating thing between himself and Bernie Sanders, as I profiled in this video. Joe Biden has got a long track record, and certain parts of it haven't hurt him too much yet in this Democratic primary, but they almost certainly will at some point. The biggest one, the standout vote, would have to be his both vote for and support for the war in Iraq. There are only two of the many candidates running in the Democratic primary who are actually in a position to vote for or against that war. And Joe Biden didn't just support it, he vocally advocated for it in a number of different ways. But that's not the story he's telling these days. If you ask him now, he was never all that into the war, okay? And let's take a look at what's changed between back then, all of his quotes, and we've got many of them, and the way he's talking about it now. Now he says, "I think my record has been good," he told NPR. He explained that his rationale in authorizing the use of military force in Iraq back in 2002 was based on a commitment he had received from then President George W. Bush that he would not go to war in Iraq. So, yes, I supported it, but I supported it to oppose it. I supported it so that there wouldn't be a war. He says, in particular, Bush looked me in the eye in the Oval Office. He said he needed the vote to be able to get inspectors into Iraq to determine whether or not Saddam Hussein was engaged in dealing with a nuclear program. He got them in, and before you know it, we had shock and awe, okay? And so then he transitions and says, from the moment shock and awe started, from that moment I was opposed to the effort, and I was outspoken as much as anyone at all in the Congress and the administration. So look, that is a bold statement. Not just all that you've heard about me on this issue is wrong, but it's so wrong that I was actually one of the most outspoken against it. You should be giving me credit for opposing the war in Iraq. Okay, well that's what he says now. So we're gonna go back and we're gonna look at some of his past statements. I apologize, there's a lot here, but you need to understand not just generally what he has said, but how often and how many different contexts he said it. So much like Neo in the Matrix, I'm gonna fill you full of kung fu right now, and so just get ready. So look, he said back in a speech at the Brookings Institution in 2003, July 31st, he said, 9 months ago, I voted with my colleagues to give the President of the United States of America the authority to use force, and I would vote that way again today. It was a right vote then, and it'll be a correct vote today. So look, we're talking about now with hindsight, almost a year of hindsight on the war, he says, not only was I right, but I would still vote. Which is a far cry from the second shock and awe happened, I knew I'd made a mistake in trusting that man. So let's see, he said in advance, I'm trying to give you all the context. An immediate invasion of Iraq, he said in remarks to the Council of Foreign Relations in October 2001, was not the prudent approach. But before that makes you think that he's against it, he says a case needed to be made for international support. That same day, he went on Charlie Rose, and he said that he felt the US could lead an international coalition, but didn't necessarily need to wait for allies to take action. So look, he's gonna be able to pitch the first part as saying, I was only saying, we need to get together the international community, but then he was going to the media and saying, sure, we could lead an international coalition, but we don't need to. I mean, that's the same sort of like pro-unilateral approach that we were getting from George W. Bush. So far from, I only support this so that diplomacy can go forward, he's effectively saying that this is gonna happen and it's gonna happen one way or the other. If we have allies, that's great. If we don't have allies, we might still need to do it ourselves. More on this, he said, I think if we do this well, this is, I believe, to Larry King. I think if we do this well and we're capable of doing it, we can essentially tighten the noose around Saddam Hussein's neck so that when he does genuinely step out of line next time, we will either have the ability to move in with or without others, but with the support of the rest of the world, like we're doing now in Afghanistan. I think that eventually we go to Iraq. But in my view, Larry, the question is how we go to Iraq. Do we go to Iraq unilaterally without having built a case against Saddam, either having been involved in 9/11 or having violated tighter sanctions that we designed that tighten the noose around him? So look, start to put these pieces together, and what you have is him trying to push before the war his support for it being just about diplomacy. But now, again, this is before the war, there's this sense of inevitability that one way or another, we're going to Iraq. We can debate, whether it's part of a coalition or unilateral. We can debate whether the rationale is one or another, different things, but we're going to it one way or another. And it really feels like both the noose tightening and the international diplomacy is really just about putting a cloak of, well, we had to do it. We're being responsible. We're not just going in there because we want to. It's really about like gilding the lily. That's all it is. We're going in. We want it to look right, but we're going in. That's the important part. And that is a far cry from, I was the most vocal against this war. Who says, I think that eventually we go to Iraq, but how do we go to Iraq? If you are the most opposed to it, you don't have that sense of like futility, like fatalism, like it's gonna happen. I mean, what are you gonna do? Honestly, I'm just a senator. What could I possibly do to stop this? But there's more. In a speech at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Biden said the US would need, quote, to end the regime one way or another, and it would be, quote, downright foolish to believe the war on terror could be won if Hussein was still in power in 5 years. And so now let's add this piece to the puzzle. He takes the war on terror so seriously, how could we possibly prosecute it? How could we possibly continue it internationally if we allowed Saddam Hussein to stay in power for the next 5 years? So again, this is not just an opposition to the regime. This is not just about how we go in, but this is tying it into other foreign policy goals, which by the way, again, was exactly what George W. Bush and the neocons were doing at the time. Sure, they hated Saddam Hussein in his own right, for his own reasons, but they also tied it into other geopolitical goals that they wanted to pursue. And again, far from the most vocal opponent to this, Joe Biden was out there in the media, talking to think tanks, doing interviews, pushing the same exact message in a number of different ways. And so look, let's talk about right before the war. So the idea that he was most opposed to it. This is 3 days before the invasion of Iraq. This is a press release. This is go time. We have one last chance possibly to rally support against this war. Here is what he says. The president has concluded that the time for diplomacy is over and the time for action is at hand. Many Americans are concerned about how we got to this point and the lost opportunities along the way. But if we go to war in Iraq, we must all unite behind our men and women in uniform. I'm confident of their extraordinary skill and ultimate success. By refusing to disarm, a defiant Saddam has made the fateful choice between war and peace. Let us make sure that in winning the war, we also win the peace. Look, if you're pro-peace, I guess you like the end of it, right? We want to win the peace. Yay, he said peace, but the rest of it is terrible. Again, fatalism, inevitability, we're definitely going. And look, you can say, like if you put yourself back in the context of that time, virtually no one was speaking out in an elected position against the war in Iraq. And so I guess he just had to do it, right? No, that's not leadership. That's not a record you run for when you want to be president a couple decades later. That's I was no better or worse than anyone else at that time. And I'm gonna actually fight against that notion in 1 second. Just the idea that we have to unite behind them. No. We don't. If we think that this is a wasteful war, if we think this is gonna lead to thousands of our soldiers being killed, if we think that this could result in the deaths of over 100,000 Iraqis, then it is our job, our responsibility, and indeed, when you're a senator, your privilege to be able to speak out against it. You had a press release. That means the press cares what you say, they're gonna take it, they're gonna talk about it in the news, and instead, what do? You just support George W. Bush. That's not speaking out against the war. That's not being the most vocal critic of the war. That is going along with the neocon foreign policy agenda. That's all it was at that time. And look, a couple of years later, he does turn against it, but it took a while. It was November of 2005 2.5 years later on Meet the Press that he finally said it was a mistake. It was a mistake to assume the president would use the authority we gave him properly. I never argued that there was an imminent threat. We gave the president the authority to unite the world to isolate Saddam. And the fact of the matter is we went too soon. We went without sufficient force and we went without a plan. But Joe, you were down to go when they went. We must unite behind our men and women in arms. Like, that's what you said. No, you could have been pushing for a plan. You could have done that same press release and said, I care so much about the lives of our soldiers that I cannot back an agenda by this administration that sends them into harm's way with no plan for what happens when the entire thing blows up. And you might think, well, wait a second, everybody was talking about this being so easy. How could he have known at that time that it would go so poorly? How could he have known that there was no plan to win the war, let alone to win the peace? How could he have known that so many would die? How could he have known that it would cost so much? Well, the thing is, this is not just looking at this particular instance with hindsight. There were politicians, one of whom is running for president now, who ahead of the war, back when there was still time to rally opposition to it, was doing everything he could. And he saw the mistakes, not 2 years after, 2.5 years after the invasion, but in advance of it. And so I wanna play a section of this is Bernie Sanders. This is before the war. Here is what he had to say.
Mr. Speaker, in the brief time I have, let me give you 5 reasons why I'm opposed to giving the president a blank check to launch a unilateral invasion and occupation of Iraq, and why I will vote against this resolution. 1, I have not heard any estimates of how many young American men and women might die in such a war, or how many tens of thousands of women and children in Iraq might also be killed. As a caring nation, we should do everything we can to prevent the horrible suffering that a war will cause. War must be the last recourse in international relations, not the first. Second, I am deeply concerned about the precedent that a unilateral invasion of Iraq could establish in terms of international law and the role of the United Nations. If President Bush believes that the US can go to war at any time against any nation, what moral or legal obligation could our government raise if another country chose to do the same thing? At a time when this country has a $6 trillion national debt and a growing deficit, we should be clear that a war and a long-term American occupation of Iraq could be extremely expensive. Fifth, I am concerned about the problems of so-called unintended consequences. Who will govern Iraq when Saddam Hussein is removed? And what role will the US play in an ensuing civil war that could develop in that country? Will moderate governments in the region who have large Islamic fundamentalist populations be overthrown and replaced by extremists?
So look, honestly, looking back on this entire history up until today, I have to say that we are oddly blessed to have 2 politicians who were there to vote for or against the war, who are now running against each other. One who just went along with the administration, buttressing its points, spreading its talking points, supporting the war, and only coming to grips with how much of a mistake it was literally years later. And another who understood shockingly well all of the potential problems in advance of the war. The costs, the deaths, the waste, the chaos. What we're in right now, Bernie Sanders saw it coming a long time ago. And so it's weird that Joe Biden hasn't yet really suffered at all in the polls for his support in the war in Iraq. I understand that it's not a gigantic priority for a lot of voters right now, but once this crowd of candidates starts to get weaned down a little bit and it becomes a bigger topic where they can start to directly differentiate ourselves, this sort of history is going to come out. It's important that we understand what was actually done, what was actually said back then, and don't allow these candidates to just rewrite history to benefit themselves now. You might think that if there's anything we can all agree is terrifying, it's the prospect of nuclear war. If there's anything we can all agree needs to be avoided at all costs, it's the prospect of nuclear war. But in a study revealed earlier this year, apparently not everyone is as scared of that as you might have predicted. Take a look. The prospect of a war with North Korea, especially any kind of nuclear war with North Korea, should be one of the most terrifying things imaginable for the American people. But a new survey shows that it's really not. And that itself should be terrifying for us. I'm talking about a new study by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, who work with YouGov to ask Americans about a variety of different potential strikes against North Korea. And here is what they found. Among the most disturbing results discovered was that a large hawkish minority lurks within the US public. Over a third of respondents approve of a US preventative strike, as they call it, across all scenarios described, and appear insensitive to informational cues that most security experts would expect to reduce such levels of support. So what does that mean? What that means is they ask people if they would support some kind of war with North Korea, and then they find out that a certain percentage say yes. So then they make the cost of that war more onerous to try to lower support, to see if this is effective in lowering support for these sorts of wars. They find that in this case, there's a lot of Americans that don't really care what ends up happening. So let's talk about some specifics. Across all conditions, approval for a US preemptive strike on North Korea is notably, although not always significantly in a statistical sense, higher than preference, which means that while they might not prefer to do this sort of thing, if Trump were to strike North Korea, a significant percentage, maybe a majority of the US population would support it. So including, by the way, 33% preferring a nuclear strike against North Korea rather than some sort of conventional one. We're talking about a significant chunk of the American people saying if Donald Trump drops nuclear bombs on North Korea, I mean, 1/3 are like, yeah, that's exactly what I want, and more are like, well, I'm not gonna go against the president on this. Like, let that sink in. Preemptive nuclear war, like half the country might be okay under certain situations. And by the way, in terms of how damaging that would be, the negative results, which should be obvious when it comes to a nuclear strike, it didn't really change when they're prompting people. They say 15,000 civilians might die, or more than 1 million civilians might die. That had virtually no impact on the American people's willingness to engage in a preemptive nuclear strike. Think about that. We're not just now talking about some neocons in government. We're talking about defense contractors, or even a number of politicians in both parties who seem all too willing to engage in reckless war that has the obvious consequence of killing civilians. We have the American people being told over 1 million civilians would die, and generally a lot of them seem okay with that. And interestingly, they found that when you ask people also if they support the death penalty, you'll be shocked to find out that the people who support the death penalty are much more likely to approve of some sort of nuclear strike, even if it kills millions of civilians. When they talk to individuals in this study and ask them why they support this sort of action, many of them said things like, that's the fastest way to end North Korea, or in some cases, to end North Koreans. And so the propaganda that has made people think that North Korea is just the dictatorship, that's all it is. These people are all the same. They're not regular people like you and I. They don't need to be protected under our foreign policy. That has sunk in for a significant chunk of the American population. It's not 5%, it's not 10, it's not 20%. You are surrounded by people that if we were to start dropping nuclear bombs, many of them would be perfectly fine with that. That should be horrifying, that should be front page news. But outside of this video and an awesome write-up in Newsweek about it, I don't know how many people are actually gonna talk about this, and that's pretty scary by itself. The damage report was started as a daily analysis of the damage being done to our country and to our world. And that damage comes in many different forms. And sometimes in the deluge of news every day, we can start to forget about some of the longer term damage that's happening mostly in the background. But from the very beginning, we wanted to make sure that we did not, for too long at the very least, forget about the environment. And so from the beginning, we've kept a focus on that here at the Damage Report. Earlier this year, about a month ago, we did an analysis of just a few weeks of news on environmental regulations in the Trump administration. And even in that short time span, there was quite a bit that happened. Take a look. When it comes to the environment and Donald Trump, I think we know that, for instance, on climate change, I think Greta said it best, that trying to change his mind at this point is probably a waste of time. He's being well paid to hold the position that he has, and he's not going to do anything about climate change in the years remaining as president. But here's the thing, supposedly on things outside of climate change, he does care, and we should have certain expectations. For instance, he says very often, I want clean air and clean water, and have been making great strides in improving America's environment. But American taxpayers and American workers shouldn't pay to clean up other countries' pollution. Okay, well that's other countries' pollutions. Presumably we can still pay to clean up our own pollution though, right? In the water and in the air. He said, I am committed to keeping our air and water clean, but always remember that economic growth enhances environmental protection. Jobs matter. So that second part there, well, the middle part, is a lie. But it does reveal a little bit of a truth of what he believes about this. Sure, he likes the idea of clean air and clean water, but he really likes economic growth. And while economic growth does not actually make the environment better, which we'll get into, he thinks that that is a worthy trade-off there. And that's really the problem, because over the past month or so, I've seen multiple different studies where you have had a possible trade-off. You've had what's good for the environment and what's good for a very narrow set of corporations, or even just one corporation. And every single time he comes down on the sides of the corporation. So let's catch up a little bit with some of these recent regulation changes when it comes to the environment and what we should expect going forward. The first does have to do with our water, which he loves to talk about, and that has to do with lead. So you're taking a look at this headline, EPA proposes new regulations for lead in drinking water, which sounds good, especially with that photo of the Flint water plant there. But unfortunately, these regulations are not great. There's some good. Yes, there will have to be better documentation of remaining lead service lines, but that's really about it on the good. The EPA is not moving to require that all lead service lines be proactively replaced nationwide, as some environmental advocates had suggested. The proposal also would not change when officials have to take action. The proposal would establish a lower trigger level of lead with 10 parts per billion from the current 15. But the thing is that health experts say no amount of lead is known to be safe. And so changing it from 15 down to 10 might seem like it's moving in the right direction, but really it's placating some environmentalists when really that threshold should be far, far lower. And certainly the lead service lines that are currently existing should be taken out. Yes, it's complex. Yes, it's going to be costly, but our lives are worth it, I think. And when it comes to water, that's not the only issue. We also have coal ash, and this is even more recent news. Under a new proposal, companies will have to stop placing coal ash into unlined storage ponds near waterways by August 31st, 2020, and either retrofit those sites to make them more secure or begin to close them. Now that sounds good, but not in comparison to what we had. Unlike the Obama era rules, the EPA will allow greater leeway and more time for operators to request extensions ranging from 90 days to 3 years. Now, that sounds bad, that we were going to have these shut down in the near term, and under Trump, it's being pushed out by a number of years, but it's actually worse in some cases. If a company can demonstrate it's shutting down a coal boiler, it can petition to keep its storage ponds open for as long as 8 years, depending on their size. And I think we can all agree that 8 years is a very long time, and it's a long time where a lot of damage could be done. This rule change trades away increased costs for the coal companies for higher toxic chemical exposure in communities from the groundwater near coal burning plants. By giving fossil fuel companies longer to act, more contaminants will inevitably be released into the environment. And some of these contaminants you really don't want to mess around with. One great example of that is selenium. Selenium is a byproduct of coal ash that can cause neurological problems, paralysis, and even death when ingested in high amounts. Now, going about your regular everyday life, you're not going to encounter selenium in high concentrations. But if you happen to live in one of the environments near a coal ash deposit, and that generally is going to mean poorer people, working class Americans, people of color, you just might. Because a 2010 report from Physicians for Social Responsibility and Earth Justice found that water samples collected near coal ash contamination sites had selenium levels that were sometimes 580 times higher than the federal drinking water standard. And that's horrific. And the prospect of having to drink water contaminated in that way by something that can literally kill you for up to 8 years longer than we would have had under Obama, that is truly scary. So that's the water. What about the air? Well, a new study released Tuesday found that the amount of pollutants in US air rose between 2016 and 2018 after 7 straight years of improvement. Two economists who conducted a study of Environmental Protection Agency data found that particulate matter pollution, air pollution dropped 24% in the US between 2009 and 2016, but increased 5.5% the next 2 years. Now, there are multiple reasons for that. To be honest, it is a complex picture. You have things like increased economic activity leading to more trucks on the road. You have forest fires becoming more common, and you have regulation changes as well. So some of this is has to do with longstanding problems with our economy that need to be changed. The fact that for the most part, our shipping, whether literal ships or trucks, is incredibly bad for the environment. And when the economy is doing well, it's even worse for the environment. Some of it has to do with wildfires, which of course are becoming more common as the climate warms up. So all the more reason to do something about it. You can also get less pollutants in the air, but then you also have regulation changes by the Trump administration that are very fast in how they operate. Within just a couple of years, you have this rise in air pollution, and that rise, 5.5%, that might not sound like a lot, but for thousands of Americans, it was pretty important because that increase was associated with 9,700 premature deaths in 2018 alone. Nearly 10,000 people, or roughly 3 9/11s, died prematurely and unnecessarily because of the air pollution that they were exposed to. And like I said, there's multiple reasons that there was so much air pollution, but some of it was able to be controlled by the Trump administration, and they decided to move in a very different direction than that which had been pursued under the Obama administration. And for thousands and thousands of Americans, it was fatal, that choice. And that was 2018. What about 2019? What about 2020? What if Donald Trump gets a second term? What if those regulation changes aren't changed once again? How many thousands of Americans will die because Donald Trump feels like some of these companies can save a little bit of money by not having to undergo retrofits and regulations and things of that sort? At the very least, tens of thousands, that becomes clear. In addition, by the way, those deaths represent $89 billion worth in damages. That's not nearly as important as the lives lost, but look at that there, $89 billion. But interestingly, those companies don't pay that money. Coal companies don't pay those $89 billion. The government directly doesn't pay the $89 billions of dollars. We do, our families pay by lost productivity, medical expenses, funerals, and all of that. That cost is on us. And so again, they always love to say that they hate socialism, but when it comes to socializing the gains for private industry, they're perfectly happy to do that, even if it costs thousands of Americans their lives. And then we return to climate change, because as I alluded to there with the air pollution, dealing with climate change could also help some of those thousands of Americans to not die. And we're doing this roundup of environmental news on a pretty important day, that day being the day that the US formally begins to leave the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, we knew that this was going to happen. He announced that he would do this before he became president. Soon after he became president, he said that he was going to pull out. It has apparently taken a while to get the formal gears going on this. But in terms of the years lost, where we could have actually done something, that is what is so devastating here. It doesn't matter at the end of the day if our name happens to be on a list, even if we are the only country to pull out of the pact. So we are number one in something pretty embarrassing there. What matters is the substance. What are we doing in terms of environmental regulations, in terms of subsidizing clean energy, in terms of fundamentally rethinking the way we ship products, the way we consume products, the way we power our homes and our businesses, and the ways that we power our cars as well? All of that needs to be rethought. But unfortunately, much of that has not been done for literally years. We are at best stalling and at worst moving in reverse at a time when we cannot afford to do so. Now, there is a little silver lining here, and that is that while the federal government is deciding not to do anything when it comes to climate change, roughly half of Americans live in a state or in a locale where their government has decided to abide by the Paris Climate Accords, and that is very good news. We are a federal government, we have multiple layers of government, and so it's not all on the federal government. It's tragically, a lot of it is on them, but some of us live in states that are trying to do the right thing, and that is good. And so if you're an environmental activist, and if you're finding it difficult to get anything done at the federal level, refocus your efforts and try to get cities and states to do the right thing. But there's a little bit more dark on top of that silver lining, because while there are states that are doing the right thing, the federal government is also trying to shut down those efforts too. We talked about this recently. Trump is going to revoke California's authority to set stricter auto emissions rules. And so for all they love to say about they just worship states' rights, when it's the state's right to do right by the environment, They're not so interested in that in Washington, D.C., and so they're shutting that down. And if today they're stopping California from having higher emissions requirements for their cars, what are they gonna do for the other states tomorrow, next year, the locales that are generating clean energy and things like that, having regulations on businesses to make sure that they're cleaner and greener as well? Will the federal government abide that for a second term of Donald Trump? Perhaps it's a gamble that we wanna make. I would say with the stakes as high as they are, we can't afford to. And so when it comes to our water, when it comes to our air, when it comes to our climate at large, Donald Trump being here, it's not just, they're all bad, they're all the same. They're not all the same, okay? Donald Trump has had a singularly bad effect on the water you drink, the air you breathe, and in fact, for thousands of you, your lives itself when it comes to air pollution that has been increased through his efforts. So all of that is very important to bear in mind as we continue our efforts to change environmental regulations right now while Donald Trump is president, and certainly as we get towards the 2020 election. Donald Trump being there is horrific for the environment, and it needs to stop. So I hope that you've enjoyed this little look back at some of the different types of content that we do on the show. They don't always necessarily relate well to each other. It's a weird jumble, but we have fun with it every day, and we hope that you do too. Before I close out though, I realized that on our Thanksgiving episode, I didn't really say anything about what I was thankful for. And so to get into the spirit of the holiday, I just wanted to give you just a minute of that. And I wanna start off, I think in an area where pretty much everyone would when thinking about what they're thankful of, and that is I'm thankful for dogs. I'm thankful for my dog Hilo. He's awesome, and honestly, I don't know how I would have made it this far in life if I hadn't had him along the way. But also beyond Hilo, I'm thankful for all dogs. Dogs that I know, dogs that I dog sit for, dogs that just are on the other side of the street walking by and I like look longingly at them and imagine them pulling, away from their owner and just running across the street to me, and it doesn't happen, but I like the idea of it. So I'm thankful for dogs. Here at our workplace, I'm thankful for my coworkers, the awesome crew that makes the Damage Report, the people that I work with every single day. It's oftentimes very emotional. We deal with some weighty subjects, but we support each other, and that makes it possible to continue on with this career field, which is pretty ridiculous when you really think about it. I also want to thank everyone who inspires me, either in entertainment, awesome creative people, but also the politicians who, again, against all odds, are doing great jobs. People like AOC and Bernie Sanders and the rest of the members of the squad, and Greta's doing amazing things around the world. Inspirational people like that. I'm very thankful that they're out doing what they do. But more importantly, and I've sort of left the best for last, I'm thankful that literally tomorrow I'm getting married, which is crazy. But hopefully will generate a whole bunch of stuff for me to be thankful for in the future. My fiance Arlene is awesome. Don't know how I ended up with her. I don't think she understands it either. But as of tomorrow, there's really no backing out. So I'm thankful that we decided to do this and that she's stuck with me through, again, some pretty hard times. But life could be worse. And so thank you to you as well for allowing me to have the life that I do, because if you weren't watching these videos, it really wouldn't last very long. But anyway, for the comment sections, for the videos that we put out on this, you can of course let me know what you're thankful for this year. I'm imagining you're probably gonna go even broader than I did. But thank you for watching this episode. Thank you for watching the show every day. We really do appreciate it. And hope the holiday season is treating you well. We'll see you next Monday with the resuming of our normal thing here on the Damage Report. Thanks for listening to the full episode of The Damage Report. Support our work, listen ad-free, access members-only bonus content, and more by subscribing to Apple Podcasts at apple.co/TYT. I'm your host, John Adarola. I'll see you soon.